Hello, today's video is going to be about fundamentalism. So fundamentalism for us is going to be the subsequent lesson after the overview to fundamentalism which I've put up just a second ago. Now this is the lesson which we're going to really get in and discuss various ideas and ideologies that may crop up. So the main objectives for today's video is going to discuss and understand the sociological perspectives on fundamentalism. So this is going to be a really interesting part of the course because it's obviously something which has really hit the news quite a lot lately, and it's going to have quite a lot of interesting stuff which we can relate and possibly start to apply to the real world. Now, the definition here is provided by Almond in 2003, who defines fundamentalism as a pattern of religious militancy by which self-styled true believers attempt to arrest the erosion of religious identity and create viable alternatives to secular institutions' behaviour. Now, what do you think this means? Now, the best way to understand this is really that those who are strong religious followers want to try and prevent as much social change as possible, particularly the social change by which will erode or take away the traditional beliefs in society provided by the religion. So they're going to combat this, and they're going to try to do anything they can do to ensure that traditional values, particularly those that are portrayed by religion, are maintained and still present within their society. Now, in a nutshell, fundamentalists believe that religious beliefs have been watered down or under threat of being removed. They are defiant against the movement and want to bring religious values back to basics or back to the fundamental beliefs. So they want to try stop this erosion of their beliefs. They want them still to maintain strong and be really dominant within society as a result. So they'll do whatever they can to do this. Now, fundamentalists often return to the beliefs of an original text of which their religion is based, claiming that other followers have strayed from the original teachings and in turn have compromised the integrity of the religion, meaning that maybe they've misread it or misinterpreted actually what is meant by these traditional values or the true word of God. So they will argue that they are the ones with a true understanding as to what the religion should be doing. Now, fundamentalism is often seen as a response to the decline of influence of religion. So therefore, this is the separation of church and state, and the interaction, the relationship that was once dominant is no longer there, which is otherwise known as secularisation. Now, fundamentalism causes conflicts with other groups who they see as a threat to their religion. So this may be the wider society, or it may just simply be another religious group that's present. And it's likely to cause conflict with other followers of the same religion, who do not share the interpretation of fundamentalist beliefs. So if you look at, for example, the Stacey Dooley documentary, which is my Fanatics in My Hometown, she went to a Muslim rally, which is about a woman being arrested for a crime, and the fundamentalist beliefs that were being promoted in that rally were only promoted by 100 Muslims, and if I recall correctly, I think within Luton there are about 3,000 Muslims. So actually this is a minority. So what would happen is that minority would be in conflict with the majority's viewpoint, meaning that obviously this is where fundamentalism really comes into play, because they are a lot more extreme in their viewpoints than the majority, meaning that they are a bit more defiant in terms of the traditional beliefs that are promoted. Now, fundamentalism can be seen as a response to changes since fundamentalists seek to reverse changes that have already been taking place in society. It therefore tends to be a conservative force in terms of preserving traditional values, but can be a radical force in terms of seeking social change. Now, what I mean by that is if a society, for example, like in Iran, where it became really westernized and drifted away from the true Islamic values, where all of a sudden religion took hold and reverted the country back into a true Islamic state, that is where it can be a radical force of change, bringing it back to those good old natural values. Now, the Karen Armstrong article, which I got you guys to read in class, which really provided the idea and the discussion as to what we were looking at for this. Now, you can find this article on the New Statesman website, and it's called The Spread of Wahhabism and the West's Responsibility to the World. Now, really this is a good article because it's providing us with the basis as to the idea of fundamentalism within modern times, because as Karen Armstrong discusses, it's given us some really good examples that are useful for this to understand this topic, because they're modern examples which impact our daily lives. So, for example, everything that happened within France, really it's time for reflection and seeing as to why fundamentalism has occurred. Now, I recommend you read that article, and it gives you a good basic understanding as to what is going on in terms of the world. And in terms of fundamentalism, obviously, if you need a spare article, ask me, and I'm sure I can get you one photocopied. Now, the examples for this is fundamentalism has appeared in a wide variety of religions, in a wide variety of contexts, and appears to be becoming more common in the modern world. Now, we're going to look at various examples. We're going to look at some Islamic ones, Christian, and we're going to look at them in terms of what they are actually trying to do to the modern world. Now, the New Christian Right are a group in which we have interacted with before. Now, they are a pro-capitalist group, which obviously means that they are in favour of capitalism and the bourgeoisie and that hierarchy be maintained. Now, it's a Protestant fundamentalist group in the USA. They are radical Christians with a large following supporting the literal interpretation of the Bible, meaning that they are going to take the Bible's words and they are going to apply them to the world. They're not going to interpret them for themselves because they believe that is not their role. Now, for the Christian right, the apocalyptic demon of secular humanism, so the idea of what's happening in society between the separation of church and state, has three heads. The liberal moral relativism, so the fact that more liberal ideas have started to be promoted within society and we're not sticking to those conservative good ideas in which the Bible promotes. The feminist movement, so allowing women to gain more equality and freedom, by which they shouldn't be taking that role because the Bible does not promote that ideology. And it demands for reproductive rights, and the gay and lesbian rights movement because it's against the Bible. As a result of this analysis, the Christian right launched campaigns aimed at policing traditional gender roles. By what I mean by this is that they're going to try to ensure that men stay within their male breadwinner roles, and so their instrumental roles, whilst women maintain an expressive role. So they're going to be the primary caregivers, they're not going to go out and work, they're going to be housewives, they're going to be subservient, they're going to obey the man. So according to Clarkson, abortion and homosexuality are both a permanent defining issue for this movement. So as we can see, there's going to be quite a fundamentalist viewpoint from the mainstream American views. Now, one president that used the New Christian Right was George W. Bush, who agreed with several of the New Christian Right's ideologies, and he benefited from their voter turnout. So, by being a supporter of their movement and their literal reading of the text, means that he was able to use this to his benefit by getting the supporters to obviously go out and vote for him. In return, he embraced several items from the New Christian Right agenda, and particularly those on gender and policing traditional gender roles, so trying to get back to basics, trying to get women back in the home. Now, Dominionism here is an interesting idea. It's something which Sarah Palin, who was one of the vice president candidates, really truly believes in. So Dominionism is a trend in Protestant Christian evangelicalism and fundamentalism that encourages not just the active political participation in civic society, but also attempts to dominate the political process. So, by having many of the individuals for the New Christian Right within the political process means that we are more likely to get our country back to that traditional wholesome values in which the Bible is promoting. So this in a more recent tone has led to more of an apocalyptic view of the world. If they do not try to encourage the world to return to the traditional Christian values of the world, and the world will be facing an apocalyptic end. So it will end because we're not following that literal reading of the Bible that the New Christian Right want us to have. Now, what is Dominionism? So, it's the broad concept of Dominionism is based on the Bible's text in Genesis 1:26. And this is what it says, and this is the King James Version. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." By which man are in charge of everything. So they should ensure that these values and these natural things in which God has already implemented for us are permanent within our society. They should not be eroded or they should not be changed. They should remain dominant. So therefore, encouraging us to do whatever we can to make sure we maintain our power, our dominion over the earth, Don't let anything else take this away from us. Another example of a fundamentalist group is Al Qaeda, which is a name which many of us are very aware of. It's a Muslim group led by Osama bin Laden, who is now dead, but now has a new leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's the new leader. He originated in Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, but with a worldwide following. They are responsible for the main terrorist attacks which we know of, which are the 9/11 attacks in the USA, which saw obviously foreign policy change in a drastic movement in response to these attacks. Now, the main reason as to, or the main foundations of al-Qaeda ideology are based on the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah, who's a Sunni Muslim who disagreed with any changes within society and was classified as uncooperative due to him stating that there is not how the Quran was meant to be interpreted. He believed that the Quran was being misinterpreted and watered down as a result. So these traditional values in which the Quran wanted society to have were not being truly followed through. Now, this is the foundations of the Al-Qaeda ideology, and the foundations of this ideology have then been radicalized, have been made extreme as a result. Now, the next example, which is another Islamic example, which is ISIS. Now, they're the newest emerging radical fundamentalist group. ISIS are arguing the world should become under Islamic rule of law. In terms of Sammy Huntington's ideas here, that actually we've got the West and we've got the Islamic State in conflict with one another, which fits in with his theory. They're reading and changing the Quran to meet their views of the world. So they're changing it to try and ensure that, okay, our extreme traditional readings of the Islamic text are now applied to the world. A restructure of the Western world needs to happen in order for the jihad to stop, and that's the only time in which they will do that. An example of how they read and interpreted the Quran is through their declaration of destroying landmarks. So as we know with many polytheistic and monotheistic religions, they are images of deities or gods within worshipping areas. Now, what they argued was within the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad ordered the following: not to leave any idol without defacing it and any grave without levelling it, because the Prophet Muhammad did not want any images of himself out there, meaning that because we've done that in terms of monotheistic and polytheistic religions, we are violating the Quran's natural rule of word of law there, meaning that we need to destroy these landmarks to then follow these traditional ideologies. Now, that is the overarching ideas as to what ISIS has said there. Hamas is another group. It's a group of Palestinian Muslim fundamentalists. They're elected to power of the Gaza Strip and were opposed to the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. They fought wars with Israel and sponsored terrorist attacks on them. So that would be another fundamentalist group which you could possibly use as an example. And the last one is the Bharatiya Janata Party. It's a Hindu fundamentalist group in India, and they believe India should be run along Hindu religious lines rather than secular lines, recognising only religious minorities. So this is another one where we're looking at wanting to have mainstream ideology remain static, as it were. Now, within our examples, we should have picked up when a group becomes fundamentalist, especially with our examples, they are fighting against secularisation or the return to traditional beliefs. Now, these are the two areas which are the main focus in terms of fundamentalist groups, or both of them could be used as the main focus. Now, Steve Bruce, as we know, came up in the last video. He argues that fundamentalism is caused by secularisation. He argues that the decline of religion and modernisation, in which science and rationality have favoured, tend to undermine traditional religious values. So then this creates an immediate gut reactions from these groups because they want to fight against this and they want to maintain the traditional values which are followed in society. So secularisation can be contributed to obviously creating this fundamentalist feeling or belief system. So fundamentalism is likely to develop when religion has a single text which followers can argue with. So if one group reads it one way, another group reads it the other, there will be conflicts within each other. Religion lacks centralised authoritarian control, with which it is easier for alternative interpretations of religion to develop. So obviously if you don't have, for example, someone like the Pope, in terms of centralised control, then you would get several splinter cells off of it, which would then read the Bible or the Quran slightly differently, or Talmud if we're talking about Jewish faith. Now, followers have a common enemy. For example, in the case of Muslim fundamentalism, it's the US or Israel, or the West, whichever way you'd like to look at it. Now, recruiting. Now, there are ready supplied potential recruits for the example. Hamas can draw on large numbers of impoverished, unemployed young men in Palestine by drawing them and giving them the ideology that if they fight alongside them, then they will obviously be potentially returning the land back to traditional values by which they will not be impoverished, unemployed, or undone in any sense. Now, this is a recent issue that has been identified in the West, with some youth being radicalised and joining these groups. And we've seen throughout the news that there have been several incidents of this, particularly within the UK. An example of the most recent one is Jihad Johnny. If you know anything about that, obviously research it if you don't. But he was a UK citizen, and because he was a vulnerable individual, they were able to radicalise him and bring him into the ideology of that particular group. So they have got a ready supply of recruits in which they can access, but they tend to be the most vulnerable within society. Another reason as to why fundamentalism really occurs is that they actually have very few opportunities to engage with mainstream political values or forums. In which case, fundamentalism tends to become more radical because that is the only way in which they're going to get noticed or their voices are going to be heard. So, for example, in Iran in 1979, the Western Shah was a dictator imposing modernization on the country. He was opposed by Muslim fundamentalists and in the end was overthrown by them in a revolution. So that is the only way in which they could get their voices heard in that case, was by creating and using fundamentalist or radical movements to create a change within that society. However, it's not always just about these various ideas as to we can't be heard or there is some problems within our society. In many parts of the world, fundamentalism may represent a deliberate rejection of Western modernisation due to resentment of its effects on its society, by the idea that we want to remain in our way of life. We don't want to start to live in another country's or another society's or civilization's way of life, because it's not always the best option. Now, Almond et al. In 2003 agrees that secularisation and modernisation helped produce fundamentalism, but in addition, they see it as being caused by, and we're going to look at some of the ways in which he believes it causes it. Now, it can be caused by low levels of education and high levels of inequality, which obviously leaves people disaffected or apathetic, which means that they're vulnerable to other ideology creeping in, which would then say to them, hang on here, join us because we will create a change. Displacement of people by war, that could be something which could be really traumatic, but also quite unifying for a group to try fight against something which has displaced them. Economic problems, so they may blame the idea of a country not thriving as much as it could do due to Western intervention. Meanwhile, if we stuck with our traditional values, we would be flourishing. Chance events such as poor harvests. So, yep, because we've not done what the Bible has said, that is why we've got a poor harvest. Western imperialism. So, fundamentalist beliefs can develop amongst those opposed to US involvement in the region. Effective leadership necessary to mobilise those with a grievance. So, all of these elements are really what's going to help create or lead a person to become fundamentalist. Now, I said Karen Armstrong is going to come up an awful lot, and I really haven't lied to you here. Now, she argues that there is nothing in the Islamic religion which tends to lead towards fundamentalist beliefs. For more than a century, most Islamic leaders were in favour of westernisation and modernisation. However, the attempts to impose modernisation too rapidly on the Islamic countries without concern for the welfare of the poor has built up resentment within many Islamic populations in the world, and this has led to the growth of Islamic fundamentalism. Therefore, Armstrong is acknowledging the effects of economic and political factors can have on the development of fundamentalism. So, really acknowledging the fact that, okay, we're maybe doing it a bit too quickly, our involvement in these countries. Take it step by step by step, rather than just fling it all at them. Now, this is a video which was on BBC Panorama, which is the battle for British Islam. I'd really recommend you watch it because it is an interesting video. It talks about the idea of fundamentalism, radicalisation, etc., and really contextualises it in terms of the UK. Now, I suggest if you want to do that, quickly just pause it here, type it into iPlayer or whatever, and see if you can find it. But that's the video for today. Thank you for listening.